Chapter 36. Guinevere. Guinevere looked around. Her head was spinning, and she felt a little sick to her stomach. But she was no longer trapped in a tower, so there was that. Merlin's magic had worked. She was at the well, not too far from her mother's cottage. Her eyes fell upon the stone well in question, and she felt her heart ache a little. She thought back to the last time she'd drawn water from this well, when she'd been talking to a very nice boy she just met about becoming a bird. If only she'd known at that moment all that was in store for the two of them. She wondered if she wouldn't have just turned them both into birds right then and there and convinced Arthur to fly away forever. Oh, Arthur, she thought, I hope someday you can forgive me. She shook her head. There was no time for these thoughts. Arthur was depending on her, and she couldn't let him down. She took off down the path, fast as her legs would carry her, until she arrived at the cottage and burst through the door as she had so often done in the past, when she'd greet her mother with a cheery smile. Not a care in the world. Of course, today, Mim was not at her favorite table, playing her favorite game of cards. The cards were still there, but they were covered in a thick layer of dust. So was everything else in the place. It was clear Mim hadn't been here in months. But then, why would she come back to these humble surroundings? She had a castle now. She'd stolen a kingdom. Quinn looked around the cottage, feeling an unexpected ache in her throat. Memories came flooding back, uninvited, of all the nights she'd spent playing games at the same table, laughing as Mim would try to use magic to cheat. Or the times they'd clear the table away to create a dance floor, or curl up by the fire and tell stories, the two of them against the world. But it had been nothing more than a lie. Quinn shook her head. She couldn't think of that now. It hurt too much and would only prove a distraction. And she couldn't afford to be distracted, not while Arthur was in danger. She forced herself to turn away from their game table and all the memories it contained. Instead, she headed back to Mim's bedroom, where she kept her diaries hidden away. Mim had never liked Quinn coming back to her room, saying she needed her private space. But there was no one to stop Quinn now. The bedroom was messy and also covered in dust. There were bookcases rising high, not unlike Merlin's in his tower, filled with books and vials and beakers, potions and herbs. Quinn supposed whether you were a bad wizard or a good one, you used the same supplies. She located the shelf with the diaries easily enough, grabbing one at random and paging through it. The book was filled with rants and raves and prophecies and recipes for disturbing-sounding diseases, all scrawled in messy handwriting across the pages without regard for margins. There were drawings, too, sick and twisted figures and animals with too many heads or legs. Quinn set the book down, feeling sick to her stomach. How had she not seen the signs? How had she not known her mother's mind? Mim had always been a bit odd, almost childlike in her naughty behavior, but in a harmless, fun way. Guinevere had no idea how deep her foster mother's madness truly ran. She didn't want to read any more, but she knew she had no choice. Arthur needed her to find something, anything, to help him, and so she forced herself to pick up another book, then another. The diaries were not filled by dates, and even inside they were not always in any obvious order. There were scraps of spells, purple doodles, and bad poetry, but here and there she found actual entries, some of them distinctly about her. One caused her breath to catch in her throat. Those fools! They have no idea what they've lost. She is a treasure, a true princess of the summer country, born of fey blood with all the gifts it entails. And now she is mine, all mine, to mound as I wish. Why, she will become the most powerful wizard in the world under my tutelage. Guinevere drew in a breath, and there it was, the proof she'd been dreading all along. Mim had stolen her away, just as Merlin said. She had purposely taken Quinn from a loving family, making them think she was dead, all for her own selfish purposes. Anger rose inside of her, her blood feeling as if it were boiling under her skin. She thought of all the stories she'd been told. Mim always played the role of hero, defeating Merlin and saving Quinn's life. It was too much, far too much. All she wanted to do was collapse into tears, to surrender to the grief and curl into bed and fall into a deep sleep and never wake up. But instead she forced herself to open yet another book, turn to yet another page, and another. Guinevere hurt her arm today, falling from a tree. She screamed so loudly, I thought at first she had broken her neck. I was so worried. Guinevere keeps asking to go to town with me. She wants to meet other children her own age. But of course I can't risk it. What if someone recognized her? They'd try to take her away from me forever. Maybe I could conjure up some magical children for her to play with. Guinevere continues to be afraid of magic. I don't understand it. She would be the most amazing wizard if she just gave it a try. But I won't try to push her too much. She has to want it. Page after page about Quinn, but little she could use to help Arthur. In fact, Mim spoke practically nothing of herself as she rambled on about her daughter. She didn't reveal any weaknesses. She didn't confess any fears. In fact, Mim didn't seem to care about anything at all. Well, except me, Quinn supposed, finding yet another entry. Somehow, despite the sick and twisted origin of their relationship, Mim did seem to care about her. She turned to the last page of the diary. I can't believe it. I sent Guinevere in to help me get Arthur off the throne. And what has she done? She's gone and fallen in love with the boy. In fact, she sided with him and that blasted Merlin over her dear sweet mother. After all we've been through together, after all I sacrificed for her, doesn't that mean anything to her at all? What happened to me and her against the world? Quinn bit her lower lip, her mind suddenly churning. This was it. This was exactly it. Her mother's one weakness, the one thing that might be strong enough to take her down. But would it work? She set down the book and rose to her feet. She had to find Merlin. Now. Chapter 37. Arthur. Arthur awoke in his cell the next morning, his muscles aching from sleeping on the small, flea-ridden pile of hay the dungeon considered a bed. He hadn't slept well, to say the least, though it turned out the cold, hard stone floor of his cell had been the least of his problems. Rather, it was his mind that had kept him awake, refusing to settle, replaying over and over what was meant to happen that day, namely his execution. He tried to stay optimistic. Merlin had sworn he had a plan, and Arthur did believe him. The problem was, that plan appeared to hinge largely on the girl responsible for his being in this situation in the first place. Merlin seemed to think Guinevere had changed, but what if she was still playing her games? Still secretly on Mim's side? Wouldn't that be the best trick of all? To convince them that she would help save Arthur, only to undermine them completely and carry out her mother's wish in the end? But no, Merlin had insisted she was on their side now, that she had been deceived, but now she knew the truth, that she loved Arthur, and she would do whatever it took to keep him safe. Arthur wanted to believe it. In fact, there was nothing he wanted to believe more, because he realized he loved her, too. Her smile, her laugh, the way her brown eyes sparkled. Surely all that couldn't have been faked, right? If so, she was the best actor of them all, and Arthur the biggest fool. The jailer approached his cell, rapping on the bars with a metal pole. "Get up, your highness," he jeered. "It's time." Then he approached the Saxon king in the next cell. "You too, barbarian." Arthur rose to his feet, feeling his heartbeat quicken. He stole a glance at King Baldemar, who shrugged and gave him a hopeful look. The jailer unlocked the cell doors and opened them wide. 4 soldiers stepped up behind him, ready to escort their prisoners above ground to their awaiting deaths. They were chained together, then led upstairs through the castle keep and into the courtyard outside. A stage had been set up since Arthur had last walked through it, and on top were matching pyres of wood. A crowd had already gathered around the stage, watching the scene with nervous eyes. He could tell they were still unsure about what was going on, and they didn't like it one bit. Arthur even noted Mistress Mabel near the back, cradling Helen of Troy. When she caught sight of him, she gave him a worried look, her face torn with confusion. The guards roughly led him onto the stage and tied him to the pile of sticks. He glanced over at King Baldemar, who was not faring much better on his pyre. The king wore a look of grim determination, showing not even a hint of fear. Arthur had no idea what his own face looked like at the moment, but he could guess it wasn't so noble or brave. Though who could blame him? He wasn't a warrior, used to hard battles like the king. He was just a boy. A boy who would soon be dead if Merlin and Guinevere didn't come through. The crowd hushed as Mim stepped out from the castle up far above, standing high on a balcony, overlooking the scene below. She was wearing robes of purple with ermine trim and a crown that she must have commissioned herself, for it fit her Arthur-shaped head perfectly. She surveyed the courtyard, her gaze roving over Arthur's subjects, a mischievous look in her eyes. She was enjoying the spectacle, that was for sure. Arthur, meanwhile, searched the crowd, looking for Merlin, or Archimedes, or Guinevere even. Someone, anyone, to give him a hint that this grand rescue was actually about to happen. But he saw no familiar faces at all. Where were they? Were they hiding nearby? Did they have a plan? "Good morning, my lovelies," Mim called out from her balcony in a perfect replica of Arthur's voice, though somehow she made it sound stronger and more in control than his typically childish squeaks. "So nice to see you up so early. Are you ready to watch us execute 2 traitors who conspired against England and planned to turn it over to our enemies?" She clapped her hands in glee. "Won't that be so much fun?" Arthur could see King Baldemar roll his eyes at this. He couldn't blame him. The bigger question was, how could the crowd actually believe this was him? He never talked like that. And she wasn't finished either. "This naughty boy," she added, gesturing to Arthur below, "is accused of using sorcery to take on my appearance and tried to trick you into believing he was me. But now we know the truth. The sword and the stone proved it once again in front of everyone, revealing his deception." King Baltimore scowled at the crowd. "This boy here in front of you has more strength of character in his little finger than the lot of you do together, and you are all fools if you need a silly sword pulled from a stone to see his worth." Arthur felt a swell of pride at the king's words. Not that they would do any good, but it was nice to hear them anyway. And Baltimore was right, too, he realized. Whether the sword and the stone was a true miracle or just a trick, it should not be the only benchmark to one becoming king. A king should have to earn his place by his actions and the love of his people, not through some silly divine intervention that could be easily falsified by magic. He scanned the crowd again, biting his lower lip. Speaking of magic, where was Merlin? He was certainly taking his time. Whatever rescue he had planned, he'd better hurry up about it, or there would be no one left to rescue. Kill them! Cried someone in the crowd. Light them up! Mim smiled like a cat who had just eaten a mouse. Very well, she said. If you insist. She clapped her hands. A moment later, a man stepped onto the stage, wearing an executioner's hood to hide his face. He carried a lit torch. Arthur cringed as he stepped closer to the two pyres. Whom would he light up first? Arthur didn't exactly want to volunteer for the honor, but he also wasn't eager for a front-row ticket to his new friend's murder. He turned to the crowd. Please, he begged. You're being deceived. Even if you don't care to save my life, please try to save your own. She will tear England apart if you let her. Don't be fooled by her treachery. Mim yawned. This is boring, she jeered. Let's get on with the show. She motioned to the executioner. He stepped closer to the pyres. The smoke from his torch tickled Arthur's nose, and he fought the urge to sneeze. He didn't have much time left. Come on, Merlin. Wait! A voice rang from the crowd. For a second, Arthur thought it must be Merlin, but instead it was Guinevere who stepped out from the throng. She scrambled up onto the stage, her face filled with defiance and not a hint of fear. Arthur looked up towards Mim just in time to see her face turn white. What are you doing? She demanded. I mean, who is this girl? She corrected quickly. Get her off the stage. You know very well who I am, Guinevere replied, planting her hands on her hips. I am the girl who conspired with this boy to take you down. I am here now to turn myself in. I am as guilty as they are, and should be made to pay for my crimes in the same manner. Quinn, Arthur cried, horrified. What are you doing? But Quinn ignored him, marched over to the pyre. She climbed up onto it, behind Arthur, and pressed her back against the wood. The crowd rumbled nervously, not sure what was going on. Mim's face had turned a peculiar shade of purple. She raised her hands and flung them out towards the audience. For a moment, everyone froze in place. But then, just as quickly, they stuttered to life again, as if the spell had fizzled, or someone had broken it. Arthur gasped. Was Merlin here? Mim scowled. She tried to freeze the crowd again, but they unfroze just as easily. A hum began to rise from the courtyard. The people were starting to catch on that something was happening to them, and they didn't like it. The executioner stepped up to the pyre, raising his torch. No, Mim cried. Stop! I order you to stop! Goodbye, Mother, Guinevere said simply, meeting her mother's eyes with her own. I hope this has been fun for you. That's what you wanted, right? A little fun? Guinevere, step away from there. Stop it. You monster. Don't burn her. The executioner ignored her, lowering his torch. As the flames licked at the wood, his cloak slipped a bit from his face. Arthur gasped. It was Merlin. No! Mim's voice took on a desperation tone. She waved her hands at the pyre, but whatever magic she was trying to do clearly wasn't working against Merlin's own. Stop this, now! Smoke began to rise in the air. Quinn started to cough. Arthur's eyes stung. Whatever was supposed to happen had better happen soon, or... Roar! Arthur looked up, squinting to see through the smoke. When his eyes fell to the balcony, he realized the fake King Arthur had disappeared, and in his place, a giant purple dragon. Chapter 38. Guinevere. The crowd gasped, their eyes on the dragon. Guinevere smiled to herself even as tears slipped down her cheeks from the smoky air. It had worked. Mim had taken the bait, as Guinevere had hoped she would. To save Guinevere, the one thing she cared about in this world, she had given herself away. A moment later, Quinn found herself flying through the air, having been scooped up in Mim's new claws. The dragon deposited her safely on the balcony above, then peered at her with angry eyes. Why would you do that? She asked, her voice filled with confusion and hurt. For a moment, Quinn almost felt bad, but then she looked down at the scene below, reminding herself what this woman had done. Because, Mother, this isn't right. This isn't fun and games anymore. This is someone's life. And maybe you don't care about Arthur, but I do. I care about him. And if you ever cared at all about me, you'll stop this game right now. She swallowed hard. If you do, I'll ask Arthur to show mercy. For a moment, Mim said nothing, and Quinn dared to hope that maybe, on some level, she'd agree. But then her gaze dropped to the scene below. Merlin had freed Arthur and the Saxon king from their pyres, and was now directing the people to pass buckets of water up to the stage to put out the fires. Mim's dragon face twisted in rage. "No!" she growled. "Because then that cheating wizard will win again. I cannot stand for that. Not after the last time." "Mother," Quinn pleaded. "Who cares about—" But she was too late. Mim turned on the spot. Graceful, actually, for her gigantean size. Then, as Guinevere watched in horror, she dive bombed towards the ground below, releasing purple flames from her mouth. "Arthur!" Guinevere called in panic. "Look out!" Arthur looked up just in time to see the flames barreling towards him. He dived to the left, but it wasn't enough to avoid the fire. At the last instant, Merlin leapt in front of him, shape-shifting into a giant salamander and shielding his pupil. The flames bounced harmlessly off his slimy back, causing Mim to roar again in fury. Guinevere gripped the railing of the balcony, her knuckles turning white. She wanted to help, but what could she do from up here? Her mother wasn't just going to give up without a fight. It was then that she noticed the sword Excalibur, the one Arthur had been wearing the day they'd met, the one he'd pulled from the stone. Mim must have left it behind when she shifted into a dragon, which gave Guinevere an idea. It might have been a trick, but it was a real sword. Maybe it would still be of some use. "Arthur!" she called down to him. As he looked up, she tossed the sword off the balcony. He ran to catch it, grabbing it easily as it fell to the earth. Then he ripped it from its sheath just as Mim dived towards him for another attack. As Quinn watched breathless, he launched Excalibur at the dragon with all his might. The throw was a bit wobbly, but it did the trick, knocking Madame Mim backwards with its force and breaking her spell. Mim screamed, falling out of her shape-shifted form. She crashed to the ground, her old purple-haired body tumbling over itself 3 times before settling. Before she could sit up on her own, King Baltimore stalked over her, grabbed her by the scruff of the neck, and yanked her to her feet. Merlin turned to the crowd. "As you can see, this is not your King Arthur," he announced, perhaps unnecessarily, as it was pretty obvious at this point. "May I introduce you to Madame Mim? She's the one who's the true traitor to the realm." The crowd booed loudly, looking relieved to finally have some evidence in Arthur's favor. A few threw pieces of rotted fruit at Mim's head. Mim glowered at Merlin as apple juice streamed down her rosy cheeks. "I was just having some fun," she muttered. "Your days of fun are over, sorceress," came a new voice. "I shall personally see to that." Guinevere's eyes shifted to the crowd, trying to find the source of the voice. A moment later, a strange woman pushed her way through the throng and stepped up onto the stage. She was dressed in silver robes, and her hair fell down her back in tangles of golden curls. She looked strangely familiar, though Quinn was also pretty sure she'd never seen her before. At least not for a very, very long time. "You, madame, are under arrest for kidnapping a royal princess of the summer country," the woman stated. She clapped her hands, and a squadron of guards appeared in line behind her. But she did not take her eyes off Mim. You will be tried for treason, and be made to answer for your crimes against my country." She turned to King Baltimore. And for those against yours as well, sir, if you agree. The Saxon king bowed his head in her direction. I thank you for that. Any allies of Arthur's are allies of ours. Indeed, Arthur said, patting the king on the back. We are all in agreement on this matter. Now go and free your men from the dungeons. They have suffered enough. King Baldemar gave him a grateful look and headed towards the dungeons. Guinevere watched him go for a moment, then turned back to the woman standing before her. She felt her knees wobble. She stared at the woman, tears streaming down her cheeks. Mother, she called out in a hesitant voice, is that you? The woman's eyes lifted to the balcony. Her jaw dropped. Her hands trembled. Guinevere? She said it as a whisper, but Quinn could hear her as well as she'd been shouting, Oh, my darling girl! Suddenly, Quinn felt herself floating. Merlin had created a magical bubble that picked her up and pulled her gently to the ground. Her feet had barely touched down when she found herself running towards her mother, throwing her arms around her and squeezing her tight. Her mother squeezed her back just as hard, and Quinn felt for a moment as if her heart would burst. Oh, sweet girl, her mother murmured, stroking her hair. I'm so sorry for all you've been through. When Archimedes came and told me, I almost couldn't believe it. She shook her head. All these years, I thought you were dead. I thought you were too, Quinn sniffled. Guinevere, Mim's voice cut through the air like a knife. Quinn turned to see the old wizard on her knees, her hands tied behind her back, surrounded by guards. She gave Quinn a pleading look. Guinevere, she moaned, don't let them do this to me. Guinevere took a step towards her, looking down at her steely eyes. She wanted to be angry, furious at what this woman had done. Instead, she just felt horribly sad. Please, don't turn your back on me now, Mim begged. It's you and me against the world, remember? There was a time I believed that, Guinevere said softly, but it was never really true, it wasn't. You were always only out for yourself, and I was just your useful pawn. You claim you care about me, yet you stole my entire life away. How can I forgive you for something like that? Her voice choked on the words. Mim had been everything to her for so long, but everything had been a lie from the start. Yet another stupid game, with the highest stakes of all. Mim's face crumbled. Fat tears slid down her cheeks. Guinevere couldn't remember a time she looked so pathetic, so weak. Even when she'd had that dreaded disease, she'd had a spark left in her eyes. Now Quinn saw nothing at all. Then Mim scowled at her, her bravado seeming to return. You stupid girl, she growled. You never were any fun. She started laughing hysterically. Not any fun at all. She kept giggling as the guards began to drag her away. Guinevere sighed. Maybe not, she murmured half to herself, but at least now I know who I am and where I'm meant to be. Chapter 39. Arthur. How do you feel? Merlin asked as Arthur shoved a big hunk of meat into his mouth at the dining table about an hour later. He couldn't remember the last time he'd had a proper meal. Luckily, the castle cook, Mistress Macready, had been more than happy to throw out all the slug soup Mim had asked her to make and whip up a hearty meal fit for a king. Much better now, Arthur said after swallowing down his bite. Merlin wasn't a fan of people speaking with their mouths full. Evidently, it was considered rude in the future. Now that I've had a... He paused, trying to remember. What was that waterfall thing you rigged up so I could wash indoors? A shower? Merlin replied with a smile. A truly remarkable invention of the future. Agreed, Arthur said. I might even be willing to take one of those twice a year. Merlin sighed. Or twice a week, he tried. Let's not be ridiculous, Arthur teased. Then he sobered. So is everything all right? Have they taken Mim away? Guinevere's people left about an hour ago, Merlin said, with Mim as their invited guest. Let's just say I don't think we'll have to deal with her for the foreseeable future. Thank goodness for that, Arthur declared. I've had enough purple for a lifetime. Thank you very much. Agreed, Merlin said. I'm about ready for things to go back to a nice, boring old... He was interrupted by a door opening at the far end of the hall. Arthur looked up to see none other than Quinn, stepping through, looking at him hesitantly. She was wearing a pale blue silk dress, much in the style of her mother's, the proper attire of a princess, he supposed. He just hoped it wasn't too itchy. Guinevere, he said, his voice hitching on her name. Arthur. Merlin raised her eyebrows. Then, without a word, he snapped his fingers and poofed away in a cloud of smoke. Arthur couldn't help a small smile. The wizard knew when it was time to make an exit. Guinevere stepped up to the table. Her eyes lowered to the ground. Hello, she said in a soft voice. Hello, he returned, feeling nervous all of a sudden. I thought maybe you had left with your mother. She shook her head. I told her I'd join her soon, but I had some unfinished business first. Her cheeks turned bright red. Oh, Arthur, she murmured, looking up at him, her big brown eyes meeting his. He felt his heart pang at the look on her face. I'm so sorry. Arthur rose from the table and walked around it until they were face to face. Then he reached out, grabbed her hands, and pulled her close to him. He threw his arms around her and squeezed her tight. She was stiff at first, but eventually seemed to melt into his embrace. He pulled away and smiled at her. Thank you, he said simply. She shook her head, dropping her gaze. You shouldn't thank me. This is all my... He stopped her words with a kiss, pressing his lips against hers. She reacted with shock at first, then kissed him back. Softly, sweetly. It was perhaps the best moment in the world. Vanquishing evil was amazing, but kissing Guinevere, well, that was something else entirely. You did nothing wrong, he told her when they parted. You were lied to, deceived, and when you learnt the truth, you tried to make things better. You did make things better. I wouldn't be alive if it wasn't for you. You're a hero, Gwyn. As much a hero as any knight of the Round Table. Her cheeks colored, and a small smile slipped across her mouth. I am rather heroic, aren't I? She joked. Arthur laughed and hugged her again. At that moment, he didn't want to let her go. He didn't want to ever let her go. When they did eventually pull apart, Guinevere gazed upon him with loving eyes. So, how does it feel to be king again? She asked. Arthur pressed his lips together. Funny you should ask. She cocked her head in question. What do you mean? I've been doing a lot of thinking, he confessed. And Mim and even Kay were actually right about one thing. Why should we let some magic sword decide who should be king? The people deserve to choose the ruler they want, like they do in the 21st century. He tapped his head, trying to remember the word. Merlin called it a democracy, where people vote for their leaders. And you want people to do that? Yes, Arthur said, the idea growing stronger as he thought about it. He will hold a vote. We will hold a vote. And every man, woman, and child of London will be able to choose the leader they want. Then whoever gets the most votes will be king or queen, he added hastily, catching Quinn's look. She smiled at him. That sounds great, Arthur, she said, and I know just who will have my vote. Chapter 40. Arthur. 2 weeks later. The sun was shining high in the sky by this time Arthur awoke. He'd been up long into the night putting the finishing touches on the voting booths he and Merlin had created. He hadn't realized how exhausted he was until his head hit the pillow and he passed out immediately. And he didn't wake up until he felt Merlin shake him. Come on, boy. Are you going to sleep all day? The wizard grumped, looking displeased. You have an election to run. Arthur stretched his hands over his head, no longer tired. An election. He'd almost forgotten about that. Has anyone cast a ballot? He asked, trying to remember the terms he'd gone over with his teacher. Has anyone cast a ballot? Merlin looked at him incredulously. You might as well ask me if anyone has not cast a ballot. Half the kingdom has turned out for this election, and they all seem extremely eager to choose their next ruler. I wonder who it will end up being, Arthur mused, slipping out of bed and grabbing a tunic and a pair of tights from his wardrobe. Most likely one of those fancy knights, Sir Morian, Sir Gawain. He's very popular with the people, maybe even Sir Pellinore. He's old, but smart. Just hopefully not Kay, he made a face. Surely the people are smarter than that, right? Merlin smiled mysteriously. I guess we'll have to wait and see, he said. Arthur nodded, but deep inside he was still nervous about the whole thing. After all, leaving the kingdom's leadership up to the people had never been done before. Who knew what would come of it? He thought back to when he'd introduced the idea to the people. We need to find a proper English king, he told them. Not from some preserved destiny or a jousting tournament. The king needs to be fair and wise and true to his people. He needs to want what's best for them, not just glory for himself. He needs to understand that might does not always equal right. The biggest sword does not give you the right to rule. Instead, we need the biggest heart. So who are you appointing? A woman from the crowd had asked. Who's to be our next king? We will all decide that together, Arthur declared. The crowd went wild with this idea. Of course they'd never heard anything like it. Thank you, 21st century, Arthur thought with a small smile. Thank you, Merlin. They'd spent the next 2 weeks getting ready for the vote. Merlin was a great help, poofing himself from town to town, creating magical voting booths that would tally up their own results and send them straight to London. Meanwhile, Archimedes worked to educate the people on how to use letters to spell out their favorite candidate's name, to help those who could not read or write themselves. Arthur took a few lessons himself, so he could recognize the winner's name when it came time for him to give the results. Guinevere helped with this and promised when the vote was all over, she would teach him to read properly. Once dressed, he headed out of his chambers with Merlin and down the stairs to the great hall. There, Guinevere and Archimedes were waiting for them. Guinevere had dressed in the same simple yet elegant blue dress she'd worn to the Saxon banquet, and her hair was done up in a new set of complicated braids. She smiled as she saw Arthur stepping up to give him a hug. He hugged her back, his heart full. I voted, she told him, pulling away from the embrace. It was very exciting. I suppose I need to vote myself, he said thoughtfully. Who did you vote for? She smiled mysteriously. You're not supposed to tell who you voted for, Merlin said. Oh, he blushed. Well, then I guess I won't tell you who I'm voting for either. Guinevere stuck her nose in the air playfully. That's good, because I don't even want to know. In truth, there was only one person Arthur would think of voting for, and that was Merlin. He was the smartest man Arthur had ever met, and he believed in peace and education over war and chaos. What better person to lead the realm into a new era of prosperity and goodwill? He walked out of the castle and into the courtyard, where the voting booths had been set up. There was still a long line of townsfolk waiting to cast their ballots, but the guards escorted Arthur to the front of the line, and no one seemed to mind. He guessed he might as well take advantage of his kingly privileges while he had them. After casting his vote for Merlin, carefully spelling out the wizard's name the way Quinn had taught him, he headed back out into the courtyard. He could feel a few people in line watching him, and he smiled and waved at them and wished them luck. Everything all right? Guinevere asked, approaching him. Did you vote? I did, and yes. he responded. Then he looked around the courtyard. Though I have to admit, I'm going to miss this place. You're doing the right thing, she assured him. I'm proud of you for leaving it up to the people. Archimedes flew down from the turrets. I hear the first results are starting to come in, he said. He looked a little tired, and Arthur knew it was past his bedtime. And, he asked, curious, who's in the lead? They won't say until everyone's voted, the owl explained. But it shouldn't be much longer now. Arthur nodded, feeling a little impatient. Guinevere caught his look. Let's go take a walk somewhere, she suggested. Get your mind off things. We'll return when they're ready to announce the results. And so they did, for Arthur was no longer confined within the castle walls. He could go where he wanted, when he wanted, a freedom he never truly had before. It was a feeling he'd grown to like quite a bit. They wandered down the winding river, watching the farmers and fishermen and washerwomen go about their daily tasks. They strode down a forest path until they reached the well where they had first met. Remember when you wanted to be a bird? Guinevere teased, and fly far, far away? I'm glad I didn't, he admitted. There's so much right here. Then he glanced shyly at her. When are you leaving? He asked. She'd stay longer than she planned to already, wanting to help him set up the election before she returned to her old home. Right after they announced the winner, she said. I'm excited but nervous. I hope my family likes me. How can they not? Arthur cried indignantly, his heart squeezing at the happiness she saw on her face. Guinevere deserved this, the life she had always been meant to lead. I'll miss you, he added. So much. Guinevere looked up at him with veiled eyes. I'll miss you too, she said softly. But don't worry, I promise to come back soon. Merlin's actually offered to teach me some magic. He thinks I have the makings of a great wizard. If Merlin thinks so, then it must be true, Arthur declared. He's an expert at seeing potential. Guinevere grinned. I think I finally understand what you see in him. He's actually pretty great. He's the best, Arthur agreed, even if he is a little grumpy at times. Eventually, they headed back to the castle, though they took a little more time than perhaps was strictly necessary. When they finally reached the gates, Merlin met them, his eyes alight with excitement. It's time, he cried. The results are in. Come, come. They're waiting for you to announce them. Arthur wondered why they needed him for this, but dutifully followed Merlin into the courtyard where everyone was waiting. The place was packed, and it felt as if the whole town had turned out to hear the election results. Arthur climbed onto the same stage that had once been meant to be his funeral pyre and looked down at the crowd below. Everyone looked anxious and hopeful, and he felt a thrill of excitement race through him. Thank you for voting, he told the crowd as Sir Pellinore walked the envelope with the results to him. You should be proud that you had a part in selecting the new ruler to lead us into the future, he smiled. And now, I won't keep you in suspense anymore. He tore open the envelope. The crowd collectively seemed to hold their breaths. He unfolded the paper, looked down at it, squinted, and did a double take. Wait, what? He looked up. There must be some mistake. Guinevere grabbed the paper from his hands, scanning it with her eyes. A slow smile spread across her face. I don't think so, she said. I think this is exactly right. Arthur felt like he was about to fall over. He looked out over the faces of the people in front of them, their hopeful eyes, their big smiles. You want me to be your king? He stammered, looking down at the paper one more time, as if he expected the name to change without warning. You voted for me? The crowd erupted into cheers. Guinevere bounced up and down. Merlin grinned a wide, toothy grin, and Archimedes slapped Arthur on the back with his wing. They want you, lad, Merlin declared, not because of some miracle or some feat of strength, but because you have proved to them that you are a kind, fair, capable leader. They believe you are the one who will take them from the darkness and bring them into the light. Arthur felt too stunned to speak. He glanced at Guinevere. Her smile could have lit up the moon. Did you know about this? He asked incredulously. Of course I did, she said with a smile. The internet said so, right? Arthur shook his head, still having a hard time believing it all. But the people had spoken. They wanted him as king. So what do you say? Merlin asked, raising a bushy eyebrow. Do you want the job or what? Arthur forced his head to bob up and down. I want it, he said. I would be proud to be their king, as long as you stick around, he added, gesturing to Merlin. After all, a good king needs a good education. Merlin nodded approvingly. I'm glad you recognize that, and I'm happy to do it. After all my traveling, I could use a place to hang my hat for a while. Might as well be here in Camelot. Arthur smiled, then turned back to the crowd. Then I accept your offer, and I only hope I prove worthy of your faith in me. The crowd cheered. People began to dance and musicians took up a lively tune. Soon everyone was celebrating together. Arthur even spotted a few Saxons in the crowd, dancing and laughing with the rest. A smile crossed his face. His people, his kingdom, for now and always. He may not have been some miracle king, but the people didn't care about that. They cared about him as much as he had grown to care about them. And for the first time in his life, his true destiny was set in stone. And that's it from the Set in Stone, A Twisted Tale novel. Oh, I think that was an excellent book, don't you think? I hope you enjoyed this more than I have read to you guys, and I hope that this will give you the opportunity to either check out this book. This book came from the United Kingdom, and hopefully it will come to the United States soon. But either way, hope you enjoyed this. And look out for the rest of the A Twisted Tale Disney series. There's about 12 of them. About ready to be 13 here soon. So, till next time, bye!